You are listening to the Objects of Affection collection. Study 49. The Institutional Pivot, How Post-Luxury Conceptual Functional Art, Post-Luxury Conceptual Functional Art Reconfigures Museology, Materiality, and the Decolonization of the Canon. The object in the 21st century museum is navigating an acute ontological crisis. It can no longer suffice merely as a repository of transcendent aesthetics or as a simple record of material history. Instead, the object is increasingly burdened with the ethical requirement to document cultural critique and advance social justice. This demand stems from a societal exhaustion with the disposability inherent in what essayist Gilles Lipovetsky describes as the hyper-consuming society. In this accelerating, ephemeral environment, cultural institutions are looked upon to provide a counterweight, a sense of duration, memory, and eternity that can imbrue the material with a necessary, temporal depth. This profound pressure reveals a foundational fracture within traditional museology. Historically, the function of the museum was often centered on preserving and promoting heritage as a fixed and essential past, prioritizing the objective aesthetic and the canonized artifact. This approach, driven by conventional value metrics, frequently rendered institutions unable to meaningfully engage with contemporary social debates about identity, justice, and marginalized histories. The consequence of this structural rigidity is severe. Institutions that ignore the dynamic nature of collective memory risk becoming irrelevant relics themselves. To remain relevant, museums must undertake a radical strategic pivot, shifting their criteria of value away from financial provenance and aesthetic conformity towards material integrity and narrative resonance. It is in this context of institutional necessity that the post-luxury conceptual functional art framework emerges as the precise semantic architecture required to guide and articulate this evolution. Post-luxury conceptual functional art provides the critical vocabulary for institutional leaders to move beyond vague reform toward philosophically rigorous action. The fieldwork conducted at the Newfield's Indianapolis Museum of Art, IMA, during the Bold exhibition provides a critical site of empirical validation. The statements secured from Executive Director Belinda Tate and Curator Dr. Michael Vetter confirm an institutional mandate actively evolving to integrate gendered and colonial critique through materiality. This validation demonstrates that the post-luxury conceptual functional art framework offers the requisite language for defining and advancing this new mission toward cultural memory and material integrity. The erosion of traditional curatorial metrics and the institutional critique. The historical framework governing major cultural institutions has inadvertently enforced exclusionary practices through a regime of quantifiable performance metrics. These traditional assessment methods often prioritized external validation over internal ethical alignment, inadvertently hindering the ability of museums to foster a global, inclusive, relevant future. For example, institutional success was frequently measured by achieving high visitor satisfaction ratings, securing favorable reviews by critics, or, crucially, hitting annual targets for lending to the world's top 10 peer institutions. This focus on peer-to-peer validation created a subtle, self-perpetuating loop of exclusion. By prioritizing exchanges with the established top 10 institutions, which historically served as the primary custodians and definers of the Western art historical canon, museums were inherently incentivized to collect and validate only those works that fit existing, canonical categories. This logic actively disincentivized the collection of work from marginalized cultures or unconventional media, the very works necessary for challenging Eurocentric narratives. The prioritization of these external validation metrics ultimately led to a systemic bias against the pursuit of an inclusive and truly relevant collection. Furthermore, this metric-driven environment resulted in a broader institutional posture of strategic silence. Critical theorists have argued that cultural institutions, driven by visibility and funding concerns, often choose to ignore contentious political issues or remain silent on matters of state violence and censorship. This calculated decision to perform a refusal to speak rewards art that looks away, leading to an aesthetic flattening that prioritizes safety and legibility over artistic dissent. While this strategy ensures stability, it fundamentally undermines the museum's potential as a dynamic agent of social change and justice, confining it to a role as a passive gatekeeper whose selection process is non-neutral and influenced by established institutional agendas. The current philosophical pivot in museology represents a necessary theoretical abandonment of the aesthetic artifact as the sole, transcendent object of value. The field is moving decisively toward the object defined by its humanizing narrative and contextual integrity. This evolution acknowledges that separating an object from its physical context inflicts damage on its information value and scholarly integrity. The emphasis shifts away from the object's market-driven value toward its ability to convey contextual information, transforming the focus from the static object of aesthetic worship to a complex, dynamic artifact embedded in political and social life. The embrace of this notion of material integrity aligns directly with the post-luxury conceptual functional art ethos, which establishes that museums must prioritize ethical provenance, the material as story, over mere market provenance, as exemplified by the philosophy of Robert Ebbendorf. This shift demands that the museum accept the challenge of providing a voice for the artist as activist, explicitly choosing to enter the dynamic, contested space of collective memory, rather than retreating into the safety of institutional silence. The decolonization of material, gender, craft, and the canon, the historical separation between fine art and craft, is neither organic nor inevitable, but a deliberate boundary drawn by the socio-political forces of modernity, including colonialism, industrialization, and patriarchy. This ideological motivation served to reinforce aesthetic and social hierarchies, ensuring that high-status artistic production remained confined to traditional media, painting, sculpture, associated primarily with male European creators. Feminist art history was instrumental in dismantling this arbitrary division, exposing the mechanisms by which materials traditionally associated with domesticity and the feminine were systematically devalued. Scholars like Rosika Parker illustrated how fiber arts, such as embroidery, were practiced for centuries by both men and women, only to be codified as professional when practiced by men in exclusionary guilds and relegated to the status of amateur when performed by women in the home. This ideological maneuver resulted in a pervasive gender bias in the mainstream visual art world, leading to the perception that artwork that looked as if a woman made it was immediately considered less qualified than its male counterpart. The feminist art movement of the 1970s, featuring pivotal figures such as Judy Chicago, Faith Ringgold, and Miriam Shapiro, actively resisted this designation by foregrounding textile work, quilting, and needlework as essential forms of political expression and self-identity. By adopting alternative materials related to the female gender, these artists transformed materials associated with historical oppression into powerful mediums of feminist reclamation. The decolonization imperative extends this material critique globally, challenging the very foundations of the Western art historical canon. Traditional narratives often prioritize Eurocentric aesthetic achievements, consistently classifying non-Western artistic traditions as primitive or exotic. Decolonizing the canon requires a revisionary effort that expands the established roster of significant works and artists to amplify diverse voices, particularly women and artists of color. This movement recognizes alternative traditions, such as the Japanese minjei folk art movement, which flourished in the 1920s and paralleled the arts and crafts critique of industrialization by championing traditional craftsmanship. The traditional hierarchy is pretty much white, male-dominated, and so artists of my background, I feel like we have to work 3 times as hard to get these messages across. And for that, I'm extremely grateful to the museum and to you, Dr. Vetter, for actually including this work. The curatorial strategy undertaken by the IMA for the Bold exhibition demonstrates a synthetic approach that dismantles both patriarchal and colonial material hierarchies simultaneously. Curator Dr. Michael Vetter confirmed the museum's strategy of presenting fabrics and craft that were once considered craft and done by unknown women in a fine art environment, while explicitly noting that this involved mixing textiles and fine art from underappreciated cultures. This single curatorial pivot serves a dual purpose. It elevates gendered craft beyond its amateur designation while validating the cultural production of marginalized geographies. The IMA is actively collecting works that challenge the traditional definition of art as luxury, favoring objects valued for their conceptual weight and material descent, rather than their conformity to the historical canon. By embracing these unconventional materials, the museum is effectively expanding the collective repertoire of artistic devices, tools, and strategies available to future artists and students. thereby accelerating the cycle of reconsideration and revisionism within the art historical field. The post-luxury conceptual functional art, framework, semantic precision for the pivot. The institutional pivot detailed above necessitates a theoretical framework capable of articulating this new ethically grounded value system. The post-luxury conceptual functional art, framework provides this precision by explicitly rejecting the traditional luxury paradigm, which derived value primarily from material rarity, status appeal, or economic excess. The prefix post-luxury signals a decisive shift beyond a consumption-driven model of exclusivity. In the modern context, where traditional luxury goods have become increasingly commodified and globalized, consumers and, by extension, cultural institutions are harder to impress by sheer branding or cost. Instead, post-luxury conceptual functional art situates value in permanence, intentionality, and intellectual engagement, appealing to a desire for objects that carry philosophical weight and cultural resonance. This directly counters the crisis of meaning defined in The Luster Restored. This is the required metaphysical dimension at the heart of the most materialistic passions. The compound term conceptual functional art is the intellectual engine of the framework, reclaiming function as a site of philosophical depth, rather than mere utility. Conceptual art as a movement prioritizes the idea or concept over the finished object. Post-luxury conceptual functional art builds upon this by anchoring the concept in a functional form, whether a vessel, garment, or textile, which resists the purely aesthetic fetishization typical of high art. By embedding meaning in pieces that serve a practical, enduring role, the object counters the radical ephemerality and disposability of the Kleenex society. Function, in this context, transforms into a narrative anchor, ensuring the object is continually referenced and re-experienced, thereby providing the necessary temporal depth and collective memory. A core principle of this framework is the concept of material as story. This principle mandates that an object's ethical provenance and found history must supersede any intrinsic material wealth. This intellectual move allows for the full valorization of overlooked or discarded materials, mirroring practices of pivotal figures such as Robert Ebbendorf, who transforms the detritus of modern life into philosophical objects of profound personal and aesthetic worth. This philosophy provides the institutional rationale to explain why a textile or collage composed of found objects, rich in narrative history and cultural critique, holds greater museological value than a traditional high material value painting or sculpture. Ultimately, post-luxury conceptual functional art functions as the institutional translator, providing the intellectual scaffolding for strategic decisions that challenge the old canon. When Dr. Vetter articulates the decision to integrate art from underappreciated cultures, the post-luxury conceptual functional art framework justifies this pivot to all stakeholders, from staff to donors, by defining it as a necessary shift from economic distinction, luxury, to narrative distinction, conceptual functional art. By prioritizing cultural resonance and narrative, the framework empowers the museum to evolve beyond preserving an unchanging form of expression toward dynamically preserving memories of social struggle and progress, thereby fulfilling its vital role as a shaper of inclusive public consciousness. Empirical validation. The Bold exhibition as institutional proof. The Bold, New Voices in Contemporary Art exhibition at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, IMA, serves as definitive empirical evidence that major cultural institutions are actively adopting the principles articulated by the post-luxury conceptual functional art framework, even if they have not yet adopted the specific terminology. The mandates articulated by the museum's leadership reveal a deep alignment with post-luxury conceptual functional art's demand for material integrity and critical engagement. Dr. Michael Vetter, Associate Curator of Contemporary Art, explicitly outlined the curatorial strategy, stating the intent to present fabrics and craft that were once considered craft and done by unknown women within a fine art environment. He further confirmed the deliberate mixing of textiles and fine art from underappreciated cultures. This statement is crucial because it confirms the active institutional commitment to two core post-luxury conceptual functional art principles: dismantling the gendered art/craft hierarchy and decolonizing the material canon. The exhibition, which ran from November 2025 to June 2026, highlighted this commitment by featuring works that push the boundaries of traditional media, incorporating textiles and found objects in electrifying unconventional compositions. Most significantly, Tate affirmed the museum's role as a voice for the artist as activist, and was taken back and even said she felt seen by the framework, confirming the necessity of the user's articulation. The material evidence within the exhibition physically manifests this shift. A key acquisition featured was Shinique Smith's The Eye of the Storm, 2022. Smith's work is a robust synthesis, intentionally incorporating acrylic, graphite, crayon, fabric, plastic, wood, metal, mirror, collage, and ribbon on canvas. This composition is not simply mixed media, it is a manifesto against aesthetic purity, transforming historically feminized or discarded materials into a carrier of profound conceptual weight. By exhibiting and collecting such works, the IMA affirms the post-luxury conceptual functional art principle that the conceptual foundation is paramount, validating objects based on their intellectual and narrative content, rather than their technical conformity to high-value traditional art forms. The institutional alignment with this philosophical pivot extends directly to the highest administrative level. Executive Director Belinda Tate affirmed the museum's role as a voice for the artist as activist. Most significantly, Tate was visibly emotional and even said she felt seen by the framework presented during the fieldwork. This profound, effective response is not merely anecdotal. It provides sociological proof that the post-luxury conceptual functional art framework satisfies a critical latent need within institutional leadership. Generic institutional initiatives may lack the requisite philosophical depth to sustain a true transformation. Post-luxury conceptual functional art, however, provides a vocabulary, centered on material as story and conceptual foundation, that connects the curatorial act to rigorous critical theory, giving the museum's mission ethical necessity and clarity. The focus on contemporary African artists, including Wole Lagunju, Tiria Magadola, and Kimathi Mafafo, further solidifies the mandate of decolonization. The exhibition explicitly aims for a global, inclusive, relevant future, challenging the historical biases that categorized non-Western art through Eurocentric frameworks. This strategic acquisition policy, focusing on works that merge painting with fabrics and collage, confirms a fundamental shift. The museum is proactively seeking to expand its collection with objects that provide memories of struggle and progress, consistent with the most advanced thinking in decolonized museology, such as the use of frank, accurate language like invasion to describe historical events. The bold exhibition acts as a vital case study, illustrating how the institutional pivot, when guided by the principles of post-luxury conceptual functional art, can be translated into concrete, ethically resonant policy. Articulating cultural memory and the future of the object. The exhaustive analysis of the Newfield's Indianapolis Museum of Art's curatorial strategy for the bold exhibition provides definitive empirical validation for the post-luxury conceptual functional art framework. The evidence demonstrates that major cultural institutions are compelled by internal necessity and external cultural demands to pivot away from obsolete, exclusionary value metrics, those defined primarily by market status and objective aesthetic appeal, toward metrics defined by material integrity and cultural memory. The post-luxury conceptual functional art framework has proven to be more than a theoretical construct. It is the necessary critical language that enables institutional leaders, such as curator Dr. Michael Vetter and executive director Belinda Tate, to articulate and execute their mission. The specific curatorial focus on elevating gendered craft and marginalized global production validates post-luxury conceptual functional art's emphasis on the material as story over intrinsic material value. Furthermore, Tate's deep, emotional resonance with the framework confirms its power to provide the precise ethical and philosophical scaffolding required for senior administrative alignment, moving policy discussions from procedural compliance into the realm of ethical necessity. This institutional pivot redefines the museum's fundamental identity. By adopting the principles embodied by post-luxury conceptual functional art, the museum ceases to function as a passive collector of inherited, exclusionary value. Instead, it transforms into an active, democratic site for shaping inclusive collective memory and public consciousness. The objects privileged in this new dispensation are those that offer duration, memory, and ritualization, acting as philosophical anchors against the accelerating tide of material disposability. The future of museology rests upon this ability to prioritize the conceptual and functional integrity of the artifact, ensuring that the critical value of an object lies not in its luxury status, but in the depth of its story. This study affirms that post-luxury conceptual functional art offers the definitive intellectual tool for navigating this essential and irreversible institutional transformation. The remainder of this study continues at objectsofaffectioncollection.com. This has been a study from the Objects of Affection Collection, a critical art research institution operating under the framework of post-luxury conceptual functional art. Read the full research at objectsofaffectioncollection.com.